Flight 908 from Los Angeles to Tokyo had been in the air for a little over 3 hours. The cabin was calm, dimly lit, and wrapped in the kind of silence that only long-haul flights carried. Soft engine hum, the occasional clink of a cup, a quiet sigh from someone drifting into sleep. In seat 12F, pressed against the window, sat a 14-year-old girl named Ayla. Her small frame was bundled under a navy hoodie, her hair tied in a messy ponytail, a few strands falling over her eyes. She looked like any other teenager, quiet, observant, lost in the vast expanse of clouds below. To most people around her, she was simply another kid on an international flight. But to Ayla, clouds weren't something to gaze at. They were terrain, patterns, routes, signs she had been trained to read in ways no civilian could ever imagine. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening not to the cabin, but to the rhythm of the engines, the subtle tilt of the aircraft, the vibration under her seat. She sensed the world differently, precisely, sharply, as though every movement around her was part of a simulation she'd practiced thousands of times. Behind her, passengers chatted softly, families heading for vacations, business travelers reviewing presentations, tourists studying guidebooks. The flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, offering water and smiles. Everything seemed perfectly normal, peaceful even, and then the peace snapped. A hard jolt shook the plane, not turbulence, not the usual bumps that came with flying. This was different, fast, sharp, and decisive, as if someone had suddenly tugged the aircraft sideways. Several passengers gasped. One woman gripped her armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. A tray of drinks rattled violently on a cart, one cup tipping over and spilling juice onto the floor. Ayla's eyes snapped open instantly. She didn't look confused. She didn't panic. She simply inhaled slowly, her mind calculating. That wasn't random. It was a maneuver. The aircraft began to bank sharply, far more abruptly than a commercial jet should. Seatbelt signs dinged overhead as the cabin attendants rushed to steady themselves, attempting to mask their alarm with professional smiles. A passenger whispered, "What was that? Why is the plane turning so hard?" Another murmured, "We're not supposed to turn like this at cruising altitude." A few rows ahead, a baby began crying. A flight attendant picked up the phone connecting to the cockpit, her voice low but tense. A moment later, the speakers crackled. The captain's voice filled the cabin, strained, still controlled, but not fully steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected navigational interference. If there is anyone on board with aviation expertise, we may need assistance." The murmurs erupted immediately. What does that mean? Interference from what? Is something wrong with the plane? People looked around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, who might have a clue. Ayla didn't look around. She didn't move. She just closed her eyes again, exhaling as though she'd been waiting for this moment. Not hoping for it, not fearing it, just expecting it, because this was not a normal flight, and she was not a normal passenger. The cabin had just begun to settle when an unfamiliar buzzing frequency filled the overhead speakers, sharp, metallic, nothing like the airline's usual announcements. Passengers frowned, confused. The captain hadn't activated the intercom. This was something else. Then a crackling voice came through. "Commercial Flight 908, you are entering restricted military airspace. Identify yourselves immediately." The entire cabin fell silent. Not one breath moved. A second message followed, more urgent. "Commercial 908, respond. You are not authorized in this corridor. Redirect or you will be intercepted." People stared at each other. Why? Died. Intercepted. What does that even mean? Why would the military contact a normal flight? But Ayla already knew. She could feel it, the shift in altitude, the change in direction, the distortion in the radio waves. Whatever had just begun, it had been triggered long before the passengers even boarded. Up in the cockpit, the captain's voice rose above the chaos. "Our radios, something's jamming them. We can't respond." A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her face pale. She stopped suddenly when she noticed Ayla calmly reaching into her backpack. From inside, Ayla pulled out something small, metallic, and heavily encrypted, something no ordinary teenager should possess. A pilot access card, not commercial, not standard, but classified. She looked at the stunned attendant and spoke softly, firmly, like someone far older than 14. "Take me to the cockpit." The attendant blinked. "Sweetheart, This is a serious situation. Please sit." Ayla held out the card. Cold matte black, no visible markings except a tiny embedded code. "Tell the captain." Her voice didn't shake. "Call sign, Shadow-6. The flight attendant froze, her breath caught, her body stiffening in recognition, or maybe disbelief. Ayla wasn't surprised. Very few civilians knew the meaning behind that call sign, but flight crews received rare emergency briefings, and Shadow-6 was not a name you forgot. The attendant nodded quickly and motioned for Ayla to follow. As Ayla walked up the aisle, passengers turned and stared, whispering. "Is she going to the cockpit? What's she doing with the crew? Is that safe?" Ayla didn't respond. She didn't even hear them. Her mind was already ahead, mapping their position, estimating distance to restricted airspace, calculating military response time. The door to the cockpit opened with a sharp click. The captain and first officer turned, and their expressions instantly shifted from confusion to shock. The captain spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Shadow-6." Ayla nodded. He swallowed hard. "We were told Shadow-6 was older." Ayla tilted her head slightly. "That's intentional." The first officer's hands trembled over the controls. "We're being hailed by military units. Our systems are being jammed. What's happening?" Ayla stepped between the seats, her eyes scanning the radar screens, the altitude indicators, the flight path deviations. She understood in seconds what the crew had been struggling with for minutes. She pressed her fingertips lightly on the console. "I'm part of a classified drone intel program," she said calmly. "There's a no-fly corridor in this region. You've crossed into it, and you're about to be intercepted by active military fighters." The captain exhaled shakily. "Fighters, as in jets?" "Yes," Ayla replied, "and they're already on their way." The cockpit fell silent. Not because the situation was hopeless, but because help had just arrived. Ayla wasn't just a kid from seat 12F anymore. She was Shadow-6, the youngest covert tactician in aerial intelligence history, and the only one capable of pulling Flight 908 out of the disaster it was heading toward. A faint hiss of static cut through the quiet hum of Flight 908's cabin. At first it was so soft that only a few passengers even noticed, just an odd metallic buzz blending into the background noise. But within seconds it grew louder, sharper, more urgent, and then the voice came, not the captain, not the flight attendants, not any voice that belonged on a commercial airliner. "Commercial 908, do you copy? You have entered a restricted zone. Identify immediately." The words hit like a shockwave. People sat frozen, arms stiff, eyes wide. The cabin felt suspended in midair, not because the plane was flying, but because every heartbeat had halted at the same time. A mother clutched her son's arm. A businessman lowered his laptop slowly. Someone whispered, "What was that? Who was that?" It wasn't fear like turbulence fear. This was different, sharp, cold, electric. It was the fear that comes when you realize someone is watching your plane from the sky, and not for a good reason. The message repeated, this time louder, more forceful. "Commercial 908, respond. You are in violation of protected military airspace. Identify immediately or action will be taken." In the cockpit, the captain grabbed the radio switch, twisting knobs, tapping controls, but the panels flickered and crackled. His voice trembled as he tried again. "Tokyo Control, this is Flight 908, requesting." Static swallowed his words. He tried another channel, then another. Nothing. Just a harsh, grinding electronic distortion. As if some unseen hand had reached inside the aircraft's communication lines and twisted everything out of place. Back in the cabin, a trembling flight attendant picked up the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are momentarily experiencing interference on our communication systems." Her words were polite, calm, practiced. Her face said something else entirely. Ayla, however, didn't need to see her face. She had sensed the shift long before any of the adults did. She had counted the seconds between the first static spike and the contact message. She knew the altitude, the direction of the bank, the deviation from their intended flight path. She even knew which military zone they'd drifted toward, and what kind of aircraft would already be scrambling. This wasn't turbulence, this wasn't a glitch, this was a military-grade warning, and from where she sat in 12F, she could already tell three things. The captain couldn't respond. They were being jammed, help wasn't coming from the ground, help had to come from inside the plane. People were still whispering, "What's happening? Are we in danger? Why would the military call us?" When Ayla quietly unzipped her small black backpack. She didn't rush, she didn't fumble. Her hands moved with an eerie calm, as if she'd rehearsed this exact moment 100 times. Inside the bag sat an object she never intended to reveal, not on a crowded flight, not in front of civilians, and certainly not at 38 zeros, 0 feet. A slim matte black encrypted pilot access card. It was colder than metal should be, unmarked, familiar only to those who had clearance. Ayla slipped it into her palm, rose from her seat, and approached the nearest flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said softly. The attendant turned and froze when she saw what Ayla was holding. The card wasn't just classified. It was deep classified, the kind they were briefed about once a year, told never to expect in real life. The attendant's voice quivered. Where did you get that?" Ayla didn't change expression. "Please take me to the cockpit," she said gently, as if asking for a glass of water instead of requesting entry into the most secured part of the plane. The attendant blinked at her, breath caught between disbelief and confusion. Ayla continued, her tone quiet but unshakably firm. "Tell the captain call sign Shadow-6. The attendant's eyes widened. It was a name she had heard only once, in an emergency training module labeled Top Secret, Restricted Personnel Only. A name accompanied by warnings, protocols, and a small note. If Shadow-6 is ever aboard, follow instructions without hesitation. The attendant swallowed hard and nodded rapidly. Yes, of course, come with me. Passengers stared as Ayla walked down the aisle, their confusion growing with every step she took. Where's she going? Is she family of a pilot? Why does she have that card? Ayla didn't acknowledge them. Her heartbeat remained steady, her breathing paced, nothing about her felt like a frightened child. If anything, she looked like the only person on board who wasn't scared at all. The cockpit door opened after a coded knock. The captain, still wrestling with the dead radio systems, turned, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it? I said no one." He stopped. Completely, his eyes dropped to the card in Ayla's hand, then to her face, then back to the card. For a moment he seemed unable to form words. Finally he whispered, "You're Shadow-6. Ayla nodded once, not boastfully, not dramatically, just a simple confirmation, as if he'd asked whether she ordered the vegetarian meal. The first officer stared at her like he'd just seen a ghost, young, small, unassuming, and yet carrying a designation that outranked almost everything in their cockpit. The captain exhaled slowly. "They told us Shadow-6 operated remotely, that you were off-site intelligence, not..." He gestured awkwardly toward her. "Not a passenger on a commercial flight." Ayla stepped closer and looked over the console, her eyes scanning the flashing warnings, the jammed frequencies, the flight path deviation. She understood the entire situation in 5 seconds. She spoke calmly. "I'm part of a classified drone intel program. My work usually stays behind the scenes." She lifted her gaze to the captain. "But right now you don't have behind the scenes support." The aircraft shuddered slightly. The captain steadied himself. "What's happening out there?" he asked. Ayla pressed one hand against the panel to feel the vibrations, the subtle tremors of the engines under strain. Then she looked at him with a seriousness far beyond her age. "You've entered a restricted defense corridor," she said. "And the military thinks you're a threat. The first officer's face drained of color. A threat? We're a passenger flight. They don't know that. Ayla replied. Your transponder is glitching. Your radio is jammed. You're flying into a zone that requires instant identification. She turned her eyes to the window, where the faintest reflection of her own calm expression looked back. And because you can't respond, she paused. You are about to be intercepted. The cockpit fell absolutely silent. No one breathed. The captain whispered, intercepted as in fighters. Ayla looked him straight in the eyes. Yes, she said, and they're closer than you think. The room chilled around them, but Ayla didn't flinch. Not even a little, because Shadow-6 wasn't just her call sign. It was her purpose, and right now, Flight 908 needed her more than anyone else on Earth. For a few long, breathless minutes, Flight 908 sliced through the air in heavy silence, the cabin suspended between fear and hope. The passengers had no idea what was coming next, only that something enormous was happening far above the world they understood. Then someone gasped. A woman near the window dropped her water bottle. A man stood halfway from his seat, staring through the glass in disbelief. And then the word spread like wildfire. Jets, there are jets outside. Heads snapped toward the windows. Someone pulled up the shades on the left side of the aircraft, and a collective gasp swept through the cabin. There they were, two F-22 Raptors, sleek, angular, ghost-gray beasts slicing through the sky like silent predators, were flying in tight formation beside the commercial jet. Their presence was both beautiful and terrifying, like watching two sharks circling through clear water. Passengers pressed their faces to the glass, eyes wide, breath fogging the windows. Are we being attacked? No, they're escorting us right. Oh my God, why are they right next to us? The massive fighter jets moved with impossible precision, their sharp metallic silhouettes gleaming against the sunlit clouds. They stayed perfectly level with Flight 908, wings steady, engines a low rumble felt more than heard. Inside the cockpit, the captain's heart hammered against his ribs. They're here, he whispered, barely audible. We've been intercepted. But Ayla didn't flinch. She stood between the pilots, her eyes fixed, her mind calculating angles, distance, altitude, everything she needed. A sudden buzz of encrypted radio frequency cut through the cockpit speakers. Then a voice, deep, clear. Professional and laced with confusion. Commercial 908, this is Falcon Lead. We show an unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace. Respond immediately. The captain reached for the mic, but Ayla gently placed a hand on his arm, calm, steady, authoritative. Wait, the radio crackled again. Be advised, our instruments show a classified signature on board. Identify the shadow call sign if present. There was a long pause. Ayla stepped forward. The F-22 pilot's next words hit the cockpit like a lightning bolt. Shadow-6, is that really you on board? Confirm identity. The captain stared at Ayla, speechless. The first officer whispered, they're asking for her. Ayla lifted the microphone slowly, almost effortlessly. Her voice was still soft, but it carried a kind of restrained power that didn't belong to a child. Shadow-6, live, confirming override protocol. For a heartbeat, the radio went silent. Even the fighter jets seemed to pause midair, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Then a sharp inhale came through the radio, followed by a stunned, almost reverential silence from the F-22 pilots. When the lead pilot spoke again, his tone had transformed completely, respectful, focused, obedient. Ma'am, a Falcon squadron is standing by for your orders. The captain nearly dropped his headset. Orders, he whispered. They're waiting for her to command them. Ayla didn't turn. She was too busy analyzing the cockpit screens. GPS drift, navigation, interference, jamming spikes, their current altitude, the restricted airspace borders, the closest exit vector, she calculated everything in seconds. Outside, the F-22s maintained their perfect formation, the sunlight glinting off their canopies as they waited for direction from a girl barely tall enough to see over the control panel. Ayla pressed the mic again. Falcon Lead, initiate split formation. One above, one below. Maintain escort distance at 200 meters. I'll guide you out. Copy that, Shadow-6. The pilot responded immediately. Executing now. In a breathtaking synchronized motion, the two jets peeled apart, one rising smoothly above the airliner, one dipping strategically below, forming a protective bubble around Flight 908. Passengers screamed at first, startled by the sudden movements, but the jets weren't attacking, they were shielding. Ayla pointed at the radar screen. There, that gap in the interference pattern, that's our exit corridor. The captain blinked. How did you? That signal isn't visible on our systems. It's not meant to be, Ayla replied simply. But I can see it. She stepped closer, tapping a specific spot on the panel. Set heading to 71, drop altitude by 200 feet, keep speed steady at 470 knots. The captain hesitated. You want me to change heading without clearance? Ayla looked him straight in the eyes. You don't have clearance. All channels are jammed. If we keep going, the Raptors will be forced to escalate. A cold shiver ran down the captain's spine. He adjusted the controls. The plane dipped slightly, turning into the new heading. Instantly, the F-22 above them mirrored the shift, sliding effortlessly into position. The one below corrected its angle as well, holding tight formation like two enormous guard dogs flanking a vulnerable stray. The radio crackled. Shadow-6, Falcon lead. New trajectory confirmed. Interference is intensifying at your 12 o'clock recon. Mend banking left 5 degrees. Ayla nodded, already ahead of him. Approved. Adjust left 5 degrees. Maintain defensive spacing. Yes, ma'am. The captain watched in open amazement. This young girl, this teenager, was controlling two of the most advanced fighter jets in the world, like she'd been doing it her whole life. Maybe she had. Ayla leaned closer to the radar, her eyes darting from one fluctuating signal to another. There's a secondary jamming pulse coming in from the east, she murmured. They're trying to push us deeper into restricted territory. The first officer frowned. You can see that without military equipment. Ayla didn't look away from the panel. I don't need equipment. Another crackle. Shadow-6, this is Falcon 2. Enemy jamming pattern detected. Countermeasures armed, awaiting your go. Ayla spoke into the mic, calm as ever. Negative. No countermeasures. Keep this non-aggressive. Deploy frequency shield instead. Copy. Activating shield. A deep hum resonated through the cockpit, felt more than heard, as the lower F-22 emitted a wave of electromagnetic counter-frequency. The interference spikes on the radar dropped sharply. Ayla breathed out slowly. There it is, that's our path out. Behind her, the captain whispered to the first officer. She just neutralized a military-grade jamming field. At 14, the first officer murmured. At 14, Ayla pointed at the route ahead. Stay on this heading for 8 more minutes, then we hit the exit corridor. Once we're out, the F-22s will disengage. The F-22 lead pilot came through again, tone steady and respectful. Shadow-6, we're holding position. You're clear for final vector correction. Just say the word. Ayla watched the shifting lines of interference slowly pulling back like a dangerous tide. She pressed the mic. Falcon Squadron, brace for escort drop in 3 minutes. Understood, ma'am. It's an honor. The captain felt a lump form in his throat. He turned to Ayla. Shadow-6, who are you? Ayla didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed on the sky ahead, on the invisible corridor only she could see. Flight 908 glided cleanly through the last stretch of restricted airspace and into open skies. The interference vanished. The radar normalized, the aircraft leveled. Ayla lifted the mic one final time. Falcon Squadron disengage. And like ghosts slipping back into the clouds, the two F-22 Raptors broke formation, climbed sharply, and vanished into the blue. Flight 908 was safe because of her. The moment the aircraft crossed into the designated safe corridor, a soft chime echoed through the cabin. The sudden stillness felt unreal, like the sky itself had exhaled. Passengers looked around with puzzled expressions, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. They saw a calm cabin, steady wings, and a peaceful horizon. They didn't know the truth that a 12-year-old girl in seat 12F had saved their plane. In the cockpit, both pilots, exhausted, trembling, and barely holding themselves together, watched Ayla through the open door. She sat comfortably in the captain's seat, hands relaxed on the yoke as though she had done this 100 times. Maybe she had, at least in ways they couldn't imagine. Behind the aircraft, 2 F-22 Raptors flew in perfect formation, metallic silhouettes against the rising sun. These weren't just any pilots, they were members of the elite Pacific Air Defense Response, hardened veterans who had flown high, alert missions for years. But at that moment, they were quiet, respectful, almost humbled. Radio static crackled softly before one of the Raptor pilots transmitted a final message. Commercial flight 9087, escort complete. You're clear to proceed. There was a short pause, then the pilot's tone changed, becoming more personal, more reverent. Shadow-6, it's an honor flying with you. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot was so stunned he forgot to breathe for a moment. The captain blinked in disbelief, unsure he had heard correctly. Shadow-6, he turned his head slowly toward Ayla. The girl looked small in the oversized seat, barely tall enough for her feet to touch the edge of the rudder pedals. Her braided hair brushed the collar of her oversized hoodie, but her eyes held something ancient, something trained, something that didn't belong to an ordinary child. She pressed the radio button with practiced ease. Her voice was soft, young but steady, likewise, Shadow-6 signing off. Her reply carried a calm authority that made even the hardened pilots outside straighten in their harnesses. The Raptors adjusted formation one final time, then banked away in a perfect synchronized arc, sunlight glinting off their canopies as they disappeared into the clouds. For a moment everything felt surreal. A child had just spoken to fighter pilots with the confidence of someone who lived in the sky. Ayla took a slow breath and leaned back, as if coming down from a long mental climb. She glanced at the instruments, checked altitude and weather, then turned to the captain. It's stable now. You can take control again. The captain nodded, swallowing a swirl of emotions, relief, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of awe. Thank you, he whispered, not as a formality, not as a polite gesture, but as a man who truly understood what she had just done. I don't know how you learned all this, but thank you. Ayla simply gave a polite smile, unbuckled the seatbelt, and slid off the captain's chair. She moved with a quiet, confident grace, the kind possessed only by those who understood pressure far beyond their years. She adjusted her small backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and walked back into the cabin as if she had only borrowed a pen and returned it, not landed an aircraft with military escort. The passengers watched her walk past, none realizing that the little girl heading down the aisle had been the difference between life and death. To them, she was just another kid stretching her legs. One woman smiled warmly and said, "Sweetheart, did you get to see the cockpit?" Ayla nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am, it was interesting. Interesting, that was her word for it." The woman chuckled. "Well, that must have been exciting." Ayla only shrugged. She returned to seat 12F and sat quietly, pulling out her book. A war, not aviation adventure novel. The kind of story where a young hero solves mysteries in the clouds. She flipped the page as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But in the cockpit, two grown men still stared in disbelief at the spot she had vacated. Neither spoke for several seconds. The co-pilot finally broke the silence. "Captain, that girl, who is she?" The captain shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said, "but she knew things a civilian shouldn't. She handled the instruments better than trainees I've flown with. And her radio voice, Shadow-6, that's a call sign. A classified one. A call sign used only by high-clearance personnel in certain Allied Air Force training programs." But how could a child? He didn't finish the sentence because there was no logical end to it. He regained control of the aircraft with steady hands, still processing everything. The rest of the flight remained smooth, calm, almost eerily ordinary compared to what had just happened. As they approached Tokyo, sunrise painted the horizon gold and orange. The city skyline rose through the morning haze, shimmering towers, distant peaks, soft light glinting off the bay. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, voice returning to its calm professional tone, though a slight tremor still clung to it, "we are beginning our final descent into Tokyo. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today." He didn't mention Ayla. He didn't say a word about what truly happened. He couldn't. Not without sounding insane or violating half a dozen protocols he didn't even understand. The landing was smooth, textbook perfect. Wheels kissed the runway so gently that most passengers didn't even feel the touchdown. Applause filled the cabin, as it often does at the end of long flights. Ayla closed her book. She waited patiently as passengers stood, collecting bags, stretching, chatting. An elderly man in the next row smiled at her. "First time in Tokyo?" "Yes," she said softly. "Well, you'll love it," he replied cheerfully. Ayla smiled back, genuine, warm, but distant in a way that hinted at a world inside her few could understand. The captain stood near the exit to greet passengers as they disembarked. When Ayla approached, he straightened unconsciously, almost like a salute hidden inside a simple posture adjustment. "Thank you," he said quietly again. Ayla nodded politely. "You kept everyone calm. That matters too." Her words weren't flattery. They were acknowledgement, professional, almost. She walked down the jet bridge with the other passengers, blending into the ordinary flow of people. No one turned to look, no one clapped for her. No one knew they were walking beside someone who had been addressed with respect by two of the world's most advanced fighter pilots. She stepped into the terminal's bright light, the hum of Tokyo Narita Airport swirling around her, announcements, footsteps, chatter, rolling luggage. She was just a small girl in a big airport, but even as she disappeared into the crowd, the story was already starting to move quietly, privately through military channels. Whispered in hangars, mentioned in pilots' lounges, passed between commanders with raised eyebrows. A child, a call sign, Shadow-6. The legend was born not with fireworks, nor headlines, nor applause, but in the silent respect of pilots who understood exactly what it takes to do what she did. Among them, the truth would spread. That day, the sky belonged to a little girl in seat 12F. And somewhere in the vastness of the aviation world, a name would be remembered, not spoken loudly, but with the quiet reverence reserved for the rarest kind of skill.